The lantern light inside the Cold Creek stage station was the only warmth in the whole black world before dawn, and Simon Boone stood outside in the dark watching it like a man watching the last ember of a dying fire, knowing that if it went out, so did everything worth living for. He had not slept. He had not even tried. The moment Sheriff Dale Hutchins had appeared at his door the previous evening, hat in hand, eyes carrying that particular combination of pity and apology that men reserve for delivering sentences, Simon had known something was wrong in a way that reached past his chest and grabbed his spine. "She's leaving on the morning stage," Hutchins had said, and those 6 words had hit Simon Boone harder than any bullet he had ever taken, and he had taken two. Beatrice Barrett, leaving. He had not asked why at first. He had simply stood in the doorway of his small but honest house on the edge of Coldwater Creek, Wyoming Territory, in the autumn of 1882, and felt the bottom drop out of the world he had spent 8 months carefully constructing around the possibility of her, around the hope of her, around the slow, sacred, terrifying reality of falling in love with a woman who was unlike anyone the frontier had ever sent his way. "Before dawn," Hutchins had added, and something in his voice told Simon there was more to it than heartbreak. There was a dark past involved. There were secrets Beatrice had been keeping. There was a trap she had walked into or was walking away from, and the sheriff either could not or would not say which. So Simon had done the only thing that made any logical sense to a man who had spent the better part of his 31 years making decisions with his feet before his head caught up. He had pulled on his coat, settled his hat, and walked to the stage station before the rooster in the Hendersons' yard had even considered crowing. Now he stood in the dark, watching that lantern, listening to the sound of horses being brought around from the livery and harnessed with the particular efficiency of a departure that could not be argued with. The stage to Cheyenne, connecting from there to Denver, and from Denver, a woman could disappear into a country so wide it had swallowed better people than either of them. The door to the station opened, and the light fell out onto the planks of the boardwalk and onto Beatrice Barrett, and she stopped walking the instant she saw him. She was dressed for travel. A dark green wool jacket over a high-collared blouse, a carpetbag in her right hand, and on her face an expression that was equal parts devastation and resolve, the kind of face a person wears when they have made a decision that is costing them everything and they have forbidden themselves to look back. "Simon," she said, and his name in her mouth was both a wound and a remedy. "Going somewhere," he said, and even he could hear how quiet his voice was, not accusatory, not cold. Just quiet in the way that very deep water is quiet before it moves. She stepped off the boardwalk. "You should not be here." "Sheriff Hutchins told me you were leaving on the morning stage," Simon said. "So I came before dawn. I made no promises to the sheriff about staying home." The horses at the hitching post stamped and blew breath into the cold air. Somewhere behind the mountains to the east, the sky was beginning to show the faintest possible suggestion that the sun intended to rise again, though it had the decency not to rush. Beatrice set down her carpetbag and pressed her fingers to her mouth for a moment, a gesture Simon recognized as the one she made when she was trying not to say something she would regret. He had learned her gestures the way a man learns a landscape he intends to live in, carefully and with full attention, because he knows one day his life might depend on knowing where the cliffs are. "I have to go," she said finally. "There are things you do not know about me." "I know enough," Simon said. "You do not," she said, and her voice broke very slightly on the second word, the fracture visible for just a moment before she sealed it back up. "You know the version of me that existed for the last 8 months in Coldwater Creek. You do not know what I am running from. You do not know what followed me here. And if you knew, Simon Boone, you would not be standing in the dark at a stage station before sunrise risking your life for a woman who has already brought enough trouble into this territory." Simon took a slow step toward her, not threatening, not rushing. The same measured step he took toward a horse that was spooked, slow enough to be read as patience, deliberate enough to be read as intention. "Try me," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Behind her, through the station window, the man who ran the stage line, old Gus Mercer, was moving about with the distracted energy of someone trying very hard not to eavesdrop on something that was clearly none of his business but impossible to ignore. "You cannot fix this," Beatrice said. "Tell me what this is," Simon said, "and let me decide that for myself." The wind came down off the mountain then, the kind of cold, thin wind that moves through Wyoming in October like it owns the place, which it does, and it lifted the brim of Beatrice's hat and pushed a strand of her dark hair across her cheek, and Simon wanted very badly to reach out and move it, but he kept his hands still because this was not the moment for that. This was the moment for listening. She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, there was a decision in them that had not been there before, and whether it was the right decision or the wrong one, it was made, and she said, "You want the truth, all of it." "Yes," Simon said, "all of it." She picked up her carpetbag and said, "Not out here." They went inside. The station waiting room was sparse in the way that frontier buildings are always sparse. A few chairs, a pot-bellied stove that was doing its best, a wall-mounted bench along one side, and behind a counter, Gus Mercer, who took one look at the two of them and said he reckoned he had something to check on with the horses, and disappeared through the back door with admirable tact. Simon sat across from Beatrice, and she sat with her carpetbag on the floor between her feet like a physical statement of intent, not quite letting go of the idea of leaving, and she told him. She told him about St. Louis. She had arrived in Coldwater Creek 8 months ago on a dry April morning on that same stage she was now trying to leave on, and she had come alone, with letters of reference from a schoolteacher in Missouri and a woman's trunk of belongings, and she had taken the position at the Coldwater Creek schoolhouse when the previous teacher, Miss Opal Griffith, had left to marry a cattleman in Montana. Everyone in town had known this. What they had not known, what Beatrice had allowed no one to know, was the reason she had left St. Louis in the first place. His name was Harlan Voss, and he was not the kind of man whose name you said loudly. He was a businessman of the sort that the city of St. Louis tolerated because his money flowed through too many channels to dam up easily, and those channels included 3 gambling establishments, a distribution network for goods that did not bear close examination, and a collection of people who owed him things they could not pay back. Beatrice's father, a kind but financially foolish man named Gerald Barrett, had been one of those people. He had borrowed money from Harlan Voss to keep his printing shop solvent during a particularly bad winter in 1879, and he had paid it back, almost all of it, but not quite all, and the interest that Harlan Voss charged on the remainder was not calculated in dollars. It was calculated in access. Specifically, access to Gerald Barrett's daughter, who was 23 years old, educated, and beautiful in a way that Harlan Voss had decided he wanted for his own social advancement. He was 51. The age gap alone would have been enough to give Beatrice pause, but the man himself was worse than his years. He had a cold intelligence that he wore like a well-cut coat and used like a weapon, and he had made it very clear to Gerald Barrett that Beatrice would come to dinner, and then to events, and then, in the fullness of time, to his house. Gerald Barrett had told his daughter none of this until the night Voss had appeared at their door in a fine carriage with 2 large men who stood at a polite but unmistakable distance and smiled in a way that made the word smile feel like a threat. Beatrice had sat through one dinner. She had understood the entire situation before the soup was removed and the first course arrived. She had understood it the way a woman of her intelligence and observation always understands these things, before they are said out loud, in the space between words where meaning lives. She had left St. Louis 6 weeks later. On a morning her father did not know she was leaving until she had already gone, because if he had known, he would have been torn between his love for her and his fear of Voss, and she could not watch that happen to him. She had taken what money she had saved teaching at a private home in the city, purchased her ticket and pointed herself west. She had chosen Coldwater Creek because it was small enough that a single woman with references could find honest work without a great deal of scrutiny, and because it was far enough from St. Louis that the name Harlan Voss might not have reached it yet. But Harlan Voss, it turned out, was a man who took the concept of access very seriously. 3 weeks ago, a man had arrived in Coldwater Creek. He had registered at the hotel under the name Robert Mills, which was almost certainly not his name, and he had done what professional watchers do, which is very little that is visible. He had drunk occasionally at the saloon. He had asked questions at the dry goods store that seemed unrelated to anything but accumulated into a picture. He had, according to Sheriff Hutchins, who had taken note of him with the quiet alertness of a man who had been a lawman long enough to recognize the shape of a shadow, been watching the schoolhouse. Hutchins had told Beatrice about the watcher 2 weeks ago. He had not told Simon. And then, 4 days ago, the letter had arrived. The letter was from Harlan Voss, written in the precise, unhurried handwriting of a man who never needed to rush because he had already arranged for every possible exit to be closed, and it said that Beatrice should come back to St. Louis voluntarily, or he would send more than a single watcher. He would send men whose job was not to watch but to arrange things. He referenced Beatrice's father. He referenced the debt. He used the word consequences in a way that made every meaning of that word feel like the worst one. Beatrice had shown the letter to Sheriff Hutchins, who had read it twice and then said, with the careful honesty of a man who knew his own jurisdiction, that he could not protect her indefinitely from a man with Voss's resources in a town with no more than 1 deputy and roughly 400 residents. He had said that leaving, going somewhere Voss did not know about yet, might be her best protection. He had said he was sorry. He had meant it. And then, apparently, he had gone and told Simon Boone. He should not have done that, Beatrice said. She was not angry when she said it. She was exhausted in the specific way of someone who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time alone. Why not? Simon said. Because there is nothing you can do, Beatrice said. Harlan Voss is not a man you face down in the street at high noon, Simon. He is a man who sends other men, and then more men, and if you are in the way, you simply become another problem for him to eliminate. He does not frighten me, Simon said. That is exactly what frightens me, Beatrice said, and the truth of that landed between them like something dropped from a height, because it was not fear of Harlan Voss that had been keeping Beatrice Barrett awake at night for the last 4 days. It was fear for Simon Boone. It was the knowledge that in 8 months of living in Coldwater Creek, the most dangerous thing that had happened to her emotionally was falling in love with a quiet, deliberate, deeply decent man who ran the livery stable on the south end of town, and who had a way of paying attention to people that made them feel like the most important thing in the world, and who had, without ever making a production of it, become the person she thought about when she woke up, and the reason she took a different route home from the schoolhouse, so that the different route happened to pass the livery. She had been so careful not to let it become more than that. So careful not to let herself want what she could not have safely. And now he was sitting across from her in a stage station before dawn, having walked through the dark specifically to prevent her from leaving, and she was explaining to him all the reasons why loving her was a sentence he did not deserve. Simon had listened to all of it without interrupting. He was good at that. It was one of the things about him that she had noticed first, back in April, when he had helped carry her trunk from the stage to the schoolhouse, and she had talked too much in the way she always did when she was nervous, and he had listened to all of it without once looking like he wished she would stop. Now when she finished, the silence stretched between them like a bridge waiting to be tested. "Tell me about this man Mills," Simon said. "The watcher. He checked out of the hotel the day before yesterday," Beatrice said. "Sheriff Hutchins thinks he went back to report to Voss. He thinks we have maybe a week before whoever Voss sends next arrives." "Then we do not have a week to waste," Simon said. "Which is why I am taking the morning stage," Beatrice said. "Simon, please." "To where?" Simon said. She hesitated. "To Denver," she said. I have a friend there, a woman I knew in St. Louis who married a physician and moved west. She has agreed to take me in until I can find a position and get settled somewhere new, somewhere Voss does not know about. And you think that will hold, Simon said. He found you here, he will find you in Denver. Denver is a larger city, which means more places to hide, but it also means more places for his men to operate. I do not have another option, Beatrice said. You have one, Simon said. She looked at him. You could stay, he said. The word stay hung in the air between them with a weight that was not quite hope and not quite demand, but something in between. The weight of a question that has been building for 8 months in stolen glances, across church pews and conversations stretched long past the point where the subject had run out because neither of them wanted to be the one to end it. Simon, she said softly, I'm not asking you to stay because I am reckless, he said. I am asking you to stay because I have been thinking since the sheriff left my door, and I believe there is a way to handle Harlan Voss that does not require you to spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder in a series of cities where you know no one. He is not a man who can be handled, Beatrice said. Not out here, not by a livery man. I was not always a livery man, Simon said quietly. She looked at him. The pot-bellied stove popped. Outside, one of the stage horses shifted its weight and the traces clinked. What do you mean? She said. And Simon Boone, who had not talked about this with anyone in Coldwater Creek in the 3 years he had lived there, told her his own truth in return for hers, because that is the only fair exchange. He had come from Kansas City originally, born in 1851, the son of a railroad surveyor and a schoolteacher's daughter, which perhaps explained why a livery owner in Wyoming had found so much to talk about with a schoolteacher from Missouri. He had spent his 20s as a deputy marshal in 2 different Kansas counties, Abilene and then Dodge City, in the years when those towns were still working through the particular violent growing pains of cattle trail boomtowns. And he had been good at the work in the way that people who are naturally observant and genuinely reluctant to use force tend to be better marshals than those who are eager for it. He had left law enforcement in 1878 after a situation in Dodge City that had involved a man not unlike Harlan Voss, a man who operated behind layers of intermediaries and smiled at the right people and donated to the right causes and was, underneath all of it, a rot at the center of every transaction he touched. Simon had built a case against him through 16 months of careful, patient work. He had brought it to the circuit judge. And the circuit judge had been in the man's pocket, and Simon had found that out the hard way when 2 men had come to his boarding house one night with the specific intention of ensuring he did not testify. He had survived. One of the men had not. The other had gone to prison. The man they were both working for had moved his operations east and been someone else's problem. Simon had left Dodge City with 2 healed bullet wounds, a deep and permanent wariness of powerful men who operated outside the law while wearing the face of respectability, and a conviction that he wanted to live quietly for a while. He had found Coldwater Creek 3 years ago and bought the livery from a man who was retiring to California, and he had been quiet, and it had been good. Until April, when a dark-haired schoolteacher had stepped off the morning stage with a trunk and too much conversation, and the kind of eyes that saw things clearly and calmly and without flinching, and he had understood without quite admitting it to himself, yet that the quiet he had been building was about to become something richer and more complicated and far more worth having. Beatrice was quiet for a moment after he finished. You were a marshal, she said. Deputy, he said. But yes. You know how men like Voss operate, she said. I spent 16 months learning, he said. I know their vulnerabilities. I know the kind of documentation that destroys them. I know that men like Harlan Voss are always involved in things they cannot afford to have exposed publicly, not because they are afraid of jail, though that matters too, but because their entire power structure depends on the fiction of respectability. Remove the fiction and the structure collapses. You are talking about taking him down, Beatrice said. From here, from Coldwater Creek, Wyoming. I am talking about making him understand that the cost of pursuing you is higher than he is willing to pay, Simon said. Men like Voss are ultimately accountable to their own self-interest. If the risk to him outweighs the benefit of having you returned, he will redirect his energy toward easier targets. My father's debt, Beatrice said. He will use my father. We deal with that too, Simon said. She stared at him. You are not a livery man, she said, and it was not quite an accusation. I am a livery man, Simon said with the closest thing to a smile he had managed all morning. Who used to be a marshal. There is no contradiction there. Beatrice Barrett looked at Simon Boone across the sparse waiting room of the Coldwater Creek stage station in the gray pre-dawn light of October 1882, and she felt something shift inside her chest, not toward hope exactly, because hope was a thing she had been very careful about for the last few years, but toward a willingness to consider hope, a softening of the prohibition she had placed on herself. The stage leaves in 20 minutes, she said. I know, he said. I watch Gus Mercer harness the horses. If I stay, she said slowly, and this does not work and Voss sends men here, people in this town could be hurt. Yes, Simon said. That is a real concern and I am not dismissing it. You could be hurt, she said, and the way she said it told him everything he needed to know about where she stood, underneath all the practical objections and the sensible fears. Beatrice, Simon said, and her name in his mouth was careful and complete, the way you say a word you have been turning over in your mind for a long time and finally say out loud. I have been hurt before, and I have been safe before. And I have thought about it enough to know that the version of safe I was living before you arrived on that stage in April is not the version I want to keep living forever. She looked at him for a long, silent moment. Then she picked up her carpetbag and set it on the bench beside her, not at her feet anymore, not ready to go, just set it down to the side, and she said, Tell me your plan. And that was the moment later that Simon would identify as the one where everything changed. Not the kiss, which came much later, not the proposal, which came later still. But that moment in the gray half-light before dawn, when Beatrice Barrett set down her bag and said, Tell me your plan, and chose, tentatively and provisionally and with full awareness of the risk, to trust him. Gus Mercer came back in from the horses with the practiced obliviousness of a man who had seen enough of human drama to know when not to ask questions, and Beatrice told him she would not be taking the stage that morning after all, and Gus said that was fine. The seat could be sold to someone on the waiting list, and that was that. The plan, as Simon had been assembling it mentally through the long hours of the previous night while he sat in the dark and waited for dawn, had three components. The first was information. Simon sent a letter that very morning to a man named Arthur Deal in Dodge City, a former colleague whose work now occupied the complicated middle territory between lawman and private investigator, a profession that was gaining traction in the East and slowly making its way west. Deal was meticulous, discreet, and owed Simon a professional debt that had been sitting uncollected for 4 years. Simon's letter asked him to compile whatever documentation existed about Harlan Voss's business operations, with specific attention to anything that would be of interest to federal investigators, because men who operated the way Voss operated almost always, at some point, crossed a line that was federal in nature, whether through postal fraud, interstate commerce violations, or involvement in activities that had been federally regulated since the reforms of the 1870s. The second component was local. Sheriff Hutchins, when Simon came to him that morning and laid out his former history and his current thinking, was quiet for a long time, and then said that he had hoped something like this was possible, and that he had told Simon about Beatrice's departure precisely, because he had believed Simon might be the kind of man who would not accept the situation as fixed. He agreed to telegraph the territorial marshal's office in Cheyenne and make them aware of a potential threat to a resident of Coldwater Creek from a St. Louis operator. He agreed to keep his deputy alert to any new arrivals in town. The third component was the most delicate, and it was the one Simon discussed with Beatrice that same afternoon, sitting in the kitchen of the small house where she rented a room from the widow Elspeth Crane, with cups of coffee that Elspeth had tactfully provided before finding somewhere else to be. The third component was Beatrice's father. Gerald Barrett, living in St. Louis, was the lever Harlan Voss intended to use. The debt he held over Gerald was the foundation of his claim on Beatrice. If that foundation could be removed, the entire structure became much weaker. "I have money," Simon said. "Not a great deal, but I have been careful for 3 years and the livery does well." "How much does your father owe?" Beatrice stared at him. "You are not going to pay my father's debt to Harlan Voss." "I am going to pay your father's debt," Simon said carefully, "in a way that removes Voss's leverage while simultaneously creating a record of the transaction that can be used to demonstrate the nature of his operations. There is a particular way to do this, through a third party and with specific documentation, that makes it very difficult for Voss to accept the payment without also accepting that his methods are now on record." "He will never accept it," Beatrice said. "No," Simon agreed. "He will refuse, and that refusal, properly documented, becomes evidence of extortion. It shows that the debt was never truly about money. It was about control." Beatrice wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and was quiet for a while. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs that Elspeth Crane kept in bundles along the ceiling, and outside the window the cottonwood trees along the creek were doing what cottonwood trees do in October, which is let go of their leaves in slow, drifting gold. "You have thought about this very carefully," she said. "I had all night," Simon said. "You spent all night thinking about how to protect me," she said. "Yes," he said simply. She looked at him steadily. Beatrice Barrett was not a woman who cried easily. She was too self-possessed for that, had been taught to present a composed face to the world since she was a child. But something behind her eyes shifted in the way that very still water shifts when something deep below the surface moves. "Simon," she said. "Yes," he said. "Why?" she said. It was the simplest possible question and the most enormous one, and Simon took a moment before he answered because he wanted to answer it honestly rather than romantically, though in this case, the honest answer and the romantic answer happened to be the same thing. "Because I am in love with you," he said. "I have been for a while. I did not say it because it was not my place to say it before, and also because I thought you might run. And now you are trying to run anyway, so I suppose I have nothing left to lose by saying it." Beatrice made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but somewhere in between, and she set down her coffee cup very precisely, and she said, "I have been trying very hard not to be in love with you." "How has that been going?" Simon asked. "Terribly," she said. They sat with that for a moment, and the cottonwood leaves drifted past the window, and neither of them said anything else because nothing else needed to be said just then. Over the following 2 weeks, the town of Coldwater Creek proceeded in the way that small frontier towns proceed, with the daily business of survival and commerce and social interaction that makes up most of human life most of the time. And underneath that ordinary surface, Simon Boone worked with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent years doing difficult things without making a production of them. Arthur Deal's response came by telegraph relay from Dodge City to Cheyenne to Coldwater Creek in 10 days, and it was more useful than Simon had dared hope. Deal had been thorough in that meticulous way of his, and what he had found was a pattern of behavior that spanned 6 years and crossed state lines in ways that were very much the interest of federal investigators. Voss had been using his gambling establishments as conduits for money that originated in activities that he certainly could not describe openly, and the Postal Service had been involved in some of his communications in ways that touched on federal postal fraud statutes that had been strengthened considerably in the reforms of 1872. Deal had also found 3 individuals in St. Louis who were willing, quietly and with guarantees of protection, to provide sworn statements regarding specific incidents. The documentation, when Simon spread it across the table in Sheriff Hutchins's office, was not quite a case by itself. But it was enough to go to the territorial marshal with, and the territorial marshal was enough to go to the federal district in St. Louis with, and the federal district in St. Louis was the thing that Harlan Voss could not quietly make disappear the way he could make a circuit judge in Dodge City disappear. Sheriff Hutchins sent the documentation to Cheyenne via the next outgoing stage, with a covering letter from himself and a second one from Simon that identified his former service as a deputy marshal, and laid out the situation regarding Beatrice Barrett in terms that were clear, factual, and completely without sentiment, because sentiment was not what this situation needed from the law. It needed precision. Then they waited. 3 days after the documentation went to Cheyenne, a man arrived in Coldwater Creek on the morning stage and checked into the hotel, and he was not Robert Mills, but he had the same quality about him that Robert Mills had apparently had, a watchfulness that was not quite innocent, a curiosity about specific things that a genuine traveler passing through would have had no reason to be curious about. His name, according to the hotel register, was Thomas Farrow. Sheriff Hutchins went to see him within an hour of his arrival, and Hutchins, who was a tall man and unhurried in the way that certain kinds of authority can afford to be unhurried, sat down across from Thomas Farrow in the hotel dining room and had a conversation that Simon was not present for, but that Hutchins recounted afterward. He had told Farrow, in a conversational and pleasant tone, that Coldwater Creek was a quiet town, and that it intended to remain a quiet town, and that anyone conducting business in the town on behalf of outside interests was welcome to conduct that business openly and legally, and that any business conducted otherwise would be met with the full and recently reinforced attention of not only the town's law enforcement, but the territorial marshal's office in Cheyenne, and as of a recent development, a federal investigator who had taken an interest in the affairs of a certain St. Louis businessman. Thomas Farrow had finished his coffee, paid for his meal, and left on the afternoon stage. When Simon told Beatrice this, they were walking along the creek bank south of town, which had become, in the 2 weeks since she had not gotten on the morning stage, something that they did in the late afternoons when the school day was finished and the light was still good. It was not a formal arrangement. It had simply happened several days in a row and then continued, because some things that begin through necessity acquire momentum through pleasure and eventually become something that neither party could easily do without. Beatrice stopped walking when he told her about Farrow and stood for a moment looking at the water, which was cold and clear and moving with the particular focused urgency of a creek that knows winter is coming. "You think it is working," she said. "I think Voss is recalculating," Simon said. He did not expect federal attention. Men like him never expect it because they are accustomed to having the calculations run in their favor. He is going to have to decide whether pursuing you is worth the risk of a federal investigation into his operations. And if he decides it is, Beatrice said. "Then we are ready for that too," Simon said. She turned to look at him. "You said we," she said. "I did," he said. "You keep saying we," she said. "I keep meaning it," he said. She looked at him for a moment in the afternoon light, the creek moving behind her, the cottonwood trees bare now in the last week of October, the mountains visible in the north and west with the first real snow of the season sitting on their upper shoulders. She was wearing a dark blue coat that she had mended twice along the left cuff, which Simon had noticed because he noticed things, and her hair was pinned up in the way she wore it on school days, with a few pieces that were always escaping by late afternoon. "Simon," she said. "Yes," he said. "I want to ask you something and I need you to answer it honestly," she said. "I will try," he said. "When this is over," she said, "whatever over looks like when Voss is dealt with one way or another and I am not a problem to be solved when it is just life again, ordinary daily life, are you asking me to stay for that? Not as someone to be protected, not as a responsibility you have taken on, but for the ordinary thing." Simon looked at her for long enough that she might have thought he was struggling for an answer, but he was not struggling at all. He was simply giving the question the weight it deserved before he answered it. "There is a winter ahead," he said. "First snow is already on the mountains. It will be here in the valley within the month. And then it will be cold for a long time, and the days will be short, and there will be evenings. And I have been thinking about those evenings a great deal. Not in a way that involves rescuing anyone. In a way that involves coffee and a fire and the kind of conversation that runs from one thing to another without any particular destination. That is what I am asking you to stay for, Beatrice. The ordinary thing. Yes." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I am going to need to write to my father." "Yes," Simon said. "I am going to tell him that there is a man here who is handling the situation," she said, "and that I am not running anymore." "Yes," Simon said. "He will want to know what kind of man," she said. "What will you tell him?" Simon said. She looked at the creek for a moment and then back at him. "I will tell him," she said slowly, "that he is the kind of man who stood outside a stage station before dawn in the cold because a sheriff told him I was leaving, and that has told me more about his character than anything else I can think of." Simon did not say anything. He simply fell into step beside her as she turned back toward town, and their shoulders were close enough that they bumped gently when she turned, and neither of them moved away. The letter from the federal district in St. Louis arrived 5 weeks later, in late November, by which time the snow had indeed come to Coldwater Creek Valley, and the daily world had contracted to the warm and the local in the way that winter makes everything contract. The letter was addressed to Sheriff Hutchins, copied to Simon, and confirmed that an investigation into the business affairs of one Harlan Voss had been formally opened based on the documentation forwarded through the territorial marshal's office. The letter also confirmed, in the careful language of official correspondence, that any harassment or coercive action directed at witnesses or persons connected to the investigation would constitute an aggravating circumstance of considerable legal weight. Hutchins read the letter twice and then looked at Simon across his desk and said, "That ought to do it." "It ought to," Simon agreed. "You did good work," Hutchins said. "I had good motivation," Simon said. Hutchins, who was a perceptive man beneath the laconic exterior of a frontier sheriff, looked at him with an expression that was as close to a smile as Hutchins generally got, and said nothing further. Simon brought the letter to Beatrice that same afternoon, arriving at the schoolhouse just as the last of the children were filing out into the snow-dusted afternoon, small boots leaving small prints across the yard. Beatrice was at the blackboard, erasing the day's arithmetic, and she turned when she heard the door and saw Simon and saw the look on his face, and she set down the eraser. He handed her the letter. She read it once, quickly, and then again more slowly. When she looked up, her eyes were bright in a way that was controlled but visible. "Is it enough?" she said. "I think so," he said. "Voss is a man who protects himself first. A federal investigation is the kind of thing that makes men like him very busy reconfiguring their affairs and very uninterested in problems that are not immediately profitable. You are, in his calculation, a preference, not a necessity. A federal investigation is a necessity. You will outweigh his attention." "My father," she said. "Write to him today," Simon said. "Tell him what the letter says. Tell him the debt will be dealt with through legal channels, and that he should make no payments and no agreements with anyone representing Voss while the investigation is active. His cooperation with the federal investigators, if they contact him, will be far better protection than compliance with Voss's demands." Beatrice folded the letter carefully. She looked at the empty schoolroom, the small desks, the handmade alphabet cards along the wall that she had repainted when she arrived because the previous teacher's letters had faded. She had made this place hers over 8 months, the way you do when a place becomes the first one you have actually chosen for yourself rather than been assigned to by circumstance. "I am not leaving," she said, and it was not a question or an announcement. It was just the stating of a fact, the way you say the creek runs south or the mountains are to the west. Simply true. I know, Simon said. I want to be clear about that, she said, because I want to be clear about everything with you. All right, he said. I am not staying because I am afraid to leave, she said. I am not staying because you have provided protection. I am staying because I want to stay, because I want the ordinary thing, the evenings, the coffee, the conversations. I know, Simon said again. And I am in love with you, she said, which I was trying to avoid being but have given up avoiding. I know that too, he said, and this time he was smiling, fully and without reservation, which was something she had not seen him do very often, and which made her understand entirely why she had been so careful not to let herself want things she could not have safely. He crossed the schoolroom, which took 4 steps because it was not a large room, and he took her face in both his hands with the specific carefulness of a man who has been patient for a long time and intends to remain thoughtful even now, and he kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kind of kiss that has been building for 8 months of deliberate restraint, which meant it carried the weight of everything that had not been said during Sunday services, and late afternoon walks and conversations stretched past their subject matter. And Beatrice brought her hands up to his arms and held on. And the afternoon light came through the schoolroom windows the way winter afternoon light comes through windows in Wyoming, low and gold and brief, and absolutely beautiful. Winter deepened over Coldwater Creek in December, and the town turned inward the way frontier towns do, with more evenings at neighbors' tables and more voices in the church on Sundays and children appearing at school with red cheeks and opinions about the snow. Beatrice Barrett became, if possible, more thoroughly woven into the fabric of the town than she had already been, because people who had respected her professional competence began to understand her as a person in the warmer, fuller way that community makes possible when you have decided to stay. She and Simon fell into the rhythm of a courtship that was, in the social terms of 1882 Wyoming, conducted with appropriate visibility and propriety, which meant that the whole town knew very well what was happening and had opinions about it, most of them favorable. Mrs. Elspeth Crane, at whose house Beatrice still rented a room, said to the proprietress of the dry goods store that she thought it was about time for both of them, and the proprietress agreed, and this exchange was repeated in several variations across the community, with the gentle communal satisfaction of people who have watched 2 deserving individuals finally arrive at an obvious conclusion. Simon asked Beatrice's permission before he wrote to her father directly, which she gave with a look that suggested she found the gesture both entirely old-fashioned and completely correct for reasons she could not quite articulate. He wrote Gerald Barrett a letter in which he introduced himself honestly, including his history as a former deputy marshal and his current occupation, and explained the situation with the federal investigation in terms that were clear and reassuring, and at the end, mentioned, with the directness that was characteristic of him, that he had intentions toward Beatrice that were serious and permanent in nature, and that he hoped to earn Gerald's respect by correspondence in advance of meeting him in person. Gerald Barrett's reply came in 3 weeks, which was fast considering the state of the postal service between St. Louis and Wyoming in winter, and it was warm and relieved and full of the particular gratitude of a man who has been frightened for his daughter for a long time and has offered, carefully and credibly, the information that she is safe and loved. He said that he would very much like to meet Simon Boone. He also said, in a postscript that made Beatrice laugh aloud when she read it at Elspeth Crane's kitchen table, that he had heard enough about the situation with Harlan Voss from Beatrice's previous letters to understand that the man had apparently met his match in a livery owner from Wyoming, and that this gave him an enormous amount of satisfaction. The new year of 1883 came to Coldwater Creek with a blizzard that shut down the stage line for 4 days and gave the town a particular intimacy, the kind that comes from being collectively and temporarily snowbound and having to make the best of it, which mostly meant visiting neighbors and making a great deal of food, and talking at length about everything and nothing. Simon and Beatrice spent the blizzard evenings at Elspeth Crane's house with Elspeth herself, who was 70 and sharp-minded, and had a habit of pretending to fall asleep in her chair after dinner, while in fact listening to everything. And the conversations were the kind that covered large distances without moving from the fire, ranging from childhood and books to the nature of the land, and the politics of the territory, and the question of what Wyoming might look like in 20 years, and whether either of them intended to see it. On the third evening of the blizzard, when Elspeth had retired earlier than usual, and the house had gone quiet in the way of houses that are full of snow on all sides, Simon and Beatrice sat on opposite sides of the fire with the particular alertness of people who know they are alone and are paying full attention to that fact. "I want to ask you something," Simon said. "I know," Beatrice said. He looked at her. "Do you?" "I have known for about 2 weeks," she said. "I have been waiting for you to work up to it." "I was not working up to it," Simon said with mild dignity. "I was waiting for the right moment." "And a blizzard is the right moment," she said. "I think so," he said. "We are not going anywhere. There are no interruptions, and I have been carrying this question since November, and I would like to put it down." She looked at him with the calm attention that was one of the things he loved most about her, the way she gave her full presence to whatever was in front of her. "Beatrice Barrett," Simon said, "I would like to marry you, not because of Voss or safety or protection or any of the practical reasons that have been woven through the last few months. Those are resolved or being resolved, and they are not the point. The point is that you are the person I want to talk to every day and sit with every evening and grow old arguing about things with, and I believe you know this and feel something similar, and I am asking you directly." She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that he might have worried, except that he was watching her face, and her face was not the face of someone who was uncertain. "I have been frightened of wanting things," she said finally, "for the last few years. Harlan Voss and everything around that made me feel like wanting things was dangerous, like hope was a vulnerability." "I know," he said. "I am not frightened anymore," she said. "Or I am still a little frightened, but I am choosing differently than fear. I am choosing you." "Is that a yes?" he said, and there was a warmth in his voice that was not entirely contained. "That is a yes," she said. "Simon Boone, I will marry you." He crossed the room to her and pulled her up from her chair and held her for a long moment with his arms around her and her face against his shoulder, and outside the blizzard continued its indifferent howl, and the fire crackled its warm approval. Spring came to Coldwater Creek, the way springs come to Wyoming, which is slowly and then all at once, with mud and meltwater and the particular green that happens when land that has been under snow for months is suddenly given permission to be alive again. And it arrived the same month that the news arrived from St. Louis that Harlan Voss had been indicted by a federal grand jury on charges of postal fraud, extortion, and several related counts that Arthur Deal had provided significant evidence for. The letter from Deal came with a personal note that said the case was solid, and that Voss had been advised by his legal counsel to accept a negotiated resolution that would occupy his complete attention for the foreseeable future and preclude any interest in external matters. Beatrice read this letter in the schoolhouse during the noon hour with the spring sun coming through the windows and the sound of her students at their lunch outside, and she sat with it for a while before she went back to the afternoon lessons. Then she went back to the afternoon lessons. She told Simon that evening on the creek walk, which had resumed with the return of walkable weather, and he listened and nodded and said, "Good, good," she said. "It is good news," he said. "It is the end of it," she said. "Yes," he said. She took his arm as they walked, which she had begun doing in February and had no intention of stopping, and said, "I wrote to my father last week about the wedding." "What did you tell him?" Simon said. "I told him June," she said. "I told him the church here is small but very well built, which is the truth, and that the people are good, which is also the truth, and that I am happy." "Are you?" he said. "Unutterably," she said, which was a word she used when she wanted to be precise, and she meant it precisely. They were married on a Saturday in the second week of June 1883, in the small but well-built church that Beatrice had accurately described to her father, with Reverend Caldwell presiding and most of Coldwater Creek in attendance. Because in a town of 400 people, a wedding is an event that the community takes personally. Gerald Barrett had arrived on the Wednesday stage, looking older than Simon had expected and more nervous, but his expression when he saw his daughter, settled and sure and radiantly happy in a way that Gerald had not seen since before the trouble with Voss, was the expression of a man having a weight lifted from him that he had carried for long enough that he had forgotten what it felt like to set it down. Gerald and Simon had their first real conversation on the Thursday evening before the wedding, sitting on the porch of the house that Simon had been quietly improving for the last several months in anticipation of it being a home for two rather than one. And it went well in the way that conversations between decent men who both love the same person and want the same thing for her tend to go well. Gerald stayed for 2 weeks. He and Beatrice spent long mornings in conversation that Simon gave them space for, understanding without being told that there were things between a father and daughter that wanted privacy and time. On the second-to-last day of Gerald's visit, he came to Simon in the livery and said without preamble that he wanted to thank him. "You do not need to," Simon said. "I do," Gerald said. "She was disappearing. Before you, she was disappearing into the protection of distance, making herself smaller and more careful and further from the things she wanted. And now she is not. I do not know how you did that." "I just told her the truth," Simon said, and waited. Gerald looked at him for a moment and said, "Take care of her." "Yes," Simon said. "And let her take care of you," Gerald added, which was perceptive in a way Simon had not expected, and which told him where Beatrice had gotten her habit of noticing things. Summer in Coldwater Creek was brief and golden, the way Wyoming summers are, with long days and cold nights and a quality of light that seemed to have been specifically designed to make everything look like something worth keeping. Beatrice continued to teach, because the school needed her and she needed it, and Simon continued the livery, and they settled into the particular domestic happiness of two people who have been cautious for a long time and have finally, deliberately, given themselves permission to be otherwise. Their house, which was on the south edge of town, with a view toward the mountains that was excellent in the mornings, and even better in the evenings when the light went amber and long, had a kitchen that Beatrice arranged with the thoroughness of someone who had been living in rented rooms for years, and had specific opinions about where things should be, and a sitting room where Simon's few books joined Beatrice's considerably larger collection on a pair of shelves he built in August, and a bedroom that faced east so that the morning came in early and enthusiastic, and woke them with the kind of gold that felt like an opinion about the value of the day. In September of that first year of marriage, Beatrice discovered she was expecting a child, and told Simon on an evening that was cooling toward autumn, sitting on the porch in the last of the light. He was quiet for a moment that she waited through with the calm patience she had acquired. Then he turned to look at her with an expression that she would describe to Elspeth Crane the next day as completely undone in the best possible way, and he said, "A child." "In April, I think," she said. He reached over and took her hand and held it and said nothing further for a while, because nothing further was needed, and they sat on the porch until the sky went dark and the stars came out in the wide, irreducible abundance of the Wyoming night. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was harder than the previous one, with cold that came early and stayed late, and a series of storms in February that made even the experienced residents of Coldwater Creek express opinions about the weather that were strong by frontier standards. Beatrice, who was very obviously expecting by January, and had therefore retired temporarily from teaching to the mild distress of her students and the more significant distress of the school board, who had difficulty finding a competent substitute, spent the winter with the particular focused interiority of pregnancy, which she found alternately profound and inconvenient. Simon, for his part, became attentive in ways that Beatrice found touching and occasionally excessive, which she told him directly, because she told him most things directly, and which he received with the reasonable acknowledgement of a man who understood he was operating at the edge of where helpfulness becomes hovering and needed the calibration. Their son was born on the 5th of April, 1884, which was a cold and windy day that did not particularly care about its own historical significance, delivered by Doc Russell with Elspeth Crane in attendance, and he was healthy and loud, and had his father's dark eyes and his mother's expression of complete assessment, which was to say that he looked at the world from his first moments with an air of already taking stock of it. Simon sat with him that first evening while Beatrice slept, exhausted and complete, and held his son with the careful competence of a man who handles living things for a living and understood, holding this specific living thing, that everything he had been since his own childhood and everything he had done and left undone and arrived at had been the preparation for this room, this woman sleeping 3 feet away, this small, particular, miraculous person. They named him William Gerald Boone, William for no one specifically, and Gerald for the man in St. Louis who had been frightened for his daughter, and was now, by telegram relay, informed that he was a grandfather. Gerald Barrett arrived on the summer stage with wet eyes and a carved wooden horse that he had apparently been making in his spare time since January. Elspeth Crane held the baby and declared him perfect, which he was, in the way that all babies are perfect, and in the additional specific way that he was himself. The years that followed were the years of the ordinary thing, which is not to say uneventful, because life is not uneventful, but which were richly and satisfyingly made of the fabric of regular living, which is more interesting than people give it credit for. William grew from baby to toddler to small boy with the determined efficiency of children who have things to do and places to explore, and the livery, which had always been a business, became also an education in horses and responsibility that he absorbed the way children absorb things they see adults caring about. The Harlan-Voss matter resolved itself as Simon had predicted. The federal case resulted in a conviction in early 1885 on the postal fraud charges and a negotiated settlement on the extortion counts that resulted in Voss losing 2 of his 3 gambling establishments and paying a substantial fine and serving a shortened sentence in exchange for cooperation with the investigation. He was, by all accounts, entirely occupied with his own legal survival and had no resources to spare for pursuing women who had become inconvenient to him years earlier. He was, for all relevant purposes, finished as a threat. When the news came, Beatrice read the letter and then set it aside and went back to the bread she was making, and Simon, watching her from the doorway, understood that this was not indifference but rather the settled completeness of a person who had already resolved the thing internally, and for whom the external confirmation was simply information rather than relief. "Done," she said without looking up. "Done," he agreed. "My father will be glad," she said. "Yes," Simon said. She looked up then. "Are you glad?" "I have been glad for a while," he said. "Since the blizzard at Elspeth's mostly. This is just a legal formality that catches up to what was already true." She smiled, which she did more easily now than she had in those careful, guarded early months in Coldwater Creek, and went back to the bread. The town of Coldwater Creek changed in the middle years of the decade in the ways that frontier towns were changing everywhere, with a second general store and a proper doctor's office for Doc Russell, and a small telegraph office that made the world feel slightly smaller and slightly more connected, and a new schoolroom addition that doubled the school's capacity and required a second teacher, which Beatrice helped select with the thoroughness of someone who took the education of children very seriously indeed. In the summer of 1886, their second child arrived, a daughter they named Clara Eleanor Boone, who came into the world with considerably more composure than her brother had, and seemed from the beginning to have opinions about everything she encountered, which her parents found charming and which William, by then 2 and a bit, found alarming when she directed those opinions at him. The family they were building was exactly the family they had each, in their different ways, been cautious about wanting. Beatrice had been cautious because wanting had been dangerous. Simon had been cautious because he had spent several years convincing himself that the quiet, alone life was sufficient. It had been sufficient in the way that water is sufficient, in the sense that you can survive on it, but it is not a meal. What they had built together was a meal. Was, specifically, the kind of long, unhurried, abundant dinner that you sit at for hours because the food is good, and the company is better, and there is no reason to leave the table. Gerald Barrett came to visit each summer, staying for 3 weeks and spending most of them on the porch with William, or in the kitchen with Beatrice, or in the livery with Simon, who had concluded over the years that his father-in-law was one of the more genuinely interesting people he had ever met. A man whose financial misfortunes had stemmed from generosity rather than foolishness, and who had a curiosity about the world that his daughter had clearly inherited. In 1887, Gerald moved to Coldwater Creek. He sold the printing shop, which had never quite recovered from the years of Voss-related pressure, to a younger man in St. Louis, and he arrived on the autumn stage with more boxes than seemed reasonable and a typeface collection that had to be transported from the stage depot to the spare bedroom in 3 separate trips, and which Simon carried without complaint, because the weight of carrying it was vastly less than the weight of Gerald's happiness at finally being where his family was. Within 6 months, Gerald Barrett had established a small printing operation in a shed behind the livery that Simon helped him convert, and within a year he was printing a 2-page weekly bulletin for the town that was not quite a newspaper, but was heading in that direction, and which was read by approximately everyone in Coldwater Creek, with the particular appetite of people who live somewhere small and want to see their own lives reflected back at them in print. Arthur Deal came through Coldwater Creek once, in the spring of 1888, passing through on the stage on his way to a case in California, and he and Simon spent an evening at the house and talked about the old days with the comfortable distance of men for whom the old days are settled and closed. Deal met Beatrice and their children and said afterward to Simon, in the direct way that old colleagues speak to each other, that he was glad it had worked out the way it had. "So am I," Simon said. "You were always better at the work than you gave yourself credit for," Deal said. "The work is what it is," Simon said. "This is better." Deal looked at the house, the light in the windows, the sound of Beatrice reading to the children which was just audible through the wall, and said he did not doubt it. Sheriff Dale Hutchins retired in the fall of 1888, citing his knees and a general weariness with the administrative paperwork that had accumulated as the territory organized itself toward eventual statehood. At the retirement gathering that the town organized for him at the saloon, which was a slightly incongruous venue for what was essentially a civic celebration, but was also the only space large enough for the purpose, Hutchins found Simon and Beatrice together and said to them both, with the brevity of a man who had been saying exactly what he meant for 30 years, "I am glad I knocked on your door." "So are we," Beatrice said. Hutchins looked at her for a moment with an expression that was, from Hutchins, essentially effusive. "You came out better for staying," he said. "I did," she said, "though I would have been fine regardless." "You would have been fine," Hutchins agreed. "But not like this." His deputy, a young man named Calloway, was appointed to the position and proved adequately capable, and the town continued as towns continue. William Boone started school the following year at age 5, which meant he was a student of his mother's, which was an arrangement that several parents privately thought might be awkward, and which William himself seemed entirely undisturbed by, treating his mother in the classroom with the same complete respect he extended to her at home, which was to say that he listened carefully and argued thoughtfully and accepted corrections with the same equanimity his father had, which Beatrice found both gratifying and slightly humbling. Clara, at 3, was already reading. Simon found this out when he discovered her in the sitting room with one of Beatrice's books held at a slightly precarious angle, and her brow furrowed with exactly the expression Beatrice wore when reading something that required concentration. When he told Beatrice, she laughed and said that it was not entirely surprising given the density of books in the house and Clara's habit of sitting in on her father's reading of the evening papers, with an attention that had always seemed more purposeful than decorative. The house on the south edge of Coldwater Creek grew in the way that family houses grow, not through grand renovation, but through the accretion of necessity and preference. A room added when the children needed their own space, a proper porch that replaced the original narrow one when it became clear that Gerald Barrett spent enough time on it to justify a structure that could hold more than 2 chairs. A kitchen garden that Beatrice established with the systematic rigor of a woman who had been feeding a classroom full of other people's children for years and had strong opinions about fresh vegetables. In 1890, Wyoming became the 44th state of the Union, which Coldwater Creek celebrated with appropriate local enthusiasm, including a ceremony at which Simon was asked to say a few words because he had been a deputy marshal, and was therefore considered to have some particular relationship to the long work of establishing civil order on the frontier, which he did in the understated way that was characteristic of him, saying that the territory had always been capable of becoming a state, and that the people in it had been doing the work of one for years already, and that statehood was simply the rest of the country catching up to what was already true here, which was both modest and exactly right. Beatrice, sitting in the second row with Clara on her lap and William beside her and her father in the chair beyond, watched her husband at the podium and felt the particular full warmth of a person who is exactly where they chose to be, surrounded by the people they chose, living the life they reached out for when they had every reason to keep their hands at their sides. The dark past was behind her. The secrets were resolved. The forced choice between safety and love that she had been running from had turned out not to be the only choice available, which was a thing she had been told was possible but had not quite believed until Simon Boone stood outside a stage station before dawn and said, "Try me," and meant it. She had chosen to stay, and staying had been exactly what she thought it might be, and also better than that, in the way that the real version of the right thing always exceeds the imagined version. In the years after statehood, the town of Coldwater Creek grew in the unhurried way of a well-situated place, adding a hotel that was an improvement on the previous one, and a school addition that was the largest building project the town had undertaken, and which Beatrice oversaw with the thoroughness of someone who had been planning it in the back of her mind for years. The school now served nearly 60 children and required 3 teachers, which meant Beatrice was as much an administrator as a classroom teacher, which suited her abilities and did not entirely suit her preference, because she liked the classroom, liked the daily work of it, the way children think and ask questions that are simultaneously completely logical and completely unexpected. Simon and Gerald established, through the printing operation in the shed behind the livery, a proper newspaper by 1891, the Coldwater Creek Weekly Record, which Gerald edited with the careful enthusiasm of a man who had found, at 62, the work he had always been suited for, and which Simon contributed to occasionally with pieces about livestock and land management that were more widely read than he expected. Because ranchers and farmers are always looking for practical information, and Simon's writing had the quality that his thinking had, which was clarity without condescension. William Boone, at 7, was interested in everything in the indiscriminate and intense way of intelligent children, and his particular current fixation was the mountains visible from the back of the house to the north and west, which he had determined he would one day climb, a determination his parents regarded with the equanimity of people who understood that letting children have large ambitions was far better than the alternative. Clara, at 5, had decided she was going to be a doctor, a conclusion she had reached after a series of conversations with Doc Russell in which she had asked questions so penetrating that Russell had told Beatrice afterward that the child had a scientific mind, and that the profession would be fortunate to have her, when it eventually accepted women in those numbers, which Beatrice thought was both an accurate prediction about Clara and a reasonable, if cautious, assessment of the pace of progress. The evening that Simon would later remember as the one that completed everything they had been building, though all the evenings were complete in their way, was an ordinary one in the spring of 1892, 10 years after Beatrice had not gotten on the morning stage, and 9 years after they had married, and 8 years and more after everything with Voss had been resolved, and the world had contracted to its right size, which was this house, and this family, and this town, and this place. He came in from the livery in the last of the evening light, the long spring evening that Wyoming gives you in April and May, and the house was warm and full of the kind of noise that a house is full of when there are children in it, which is not exactly peace but is something better, the sound of a life being actively lived. Beatrice was in the kitchen, and Gerald was on the porch reading galleys for next week's paper, and William and Clara were in the sitting room involved in some game that had a complicated and apparently flexible rule structure. Judging by the periodic renegotiations Simon could hear as he hung his coat. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Beatrice at the stove, and she turned, sensing him the way people who have lived together for years learn to sense each other, the particular gravity of the familiar specific person. "Supper in 10 minutes, she said. "No hurry," he said. She looked at him for a moment with the measuring gaze that had been one of the first things he had noticed about her, the way she looked at things as if she were reading them, and said, "You look like someone who is thinking about something." "I was thinking," he said, "about October 1882. She raised an eyebrow. "About standing outside the stage station before dawn," he said. "About how the lantern was the only light in the world." "I remember," she said softly. "And about what would have happened," he said, "if Hutchins had not knocked on my door, or if I had decided it was not my place to be there. I would have been in Denver," she said, "and then somewhere else, and I would have been all right." "Yes," he said, "you would have been all right. But not like this," she said, echoing Hutchins and knowing she was. "Not like this," Simon agreed. She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him, and he folded her into his arms the way he had been doing for 9 years, with a familiarity that had never become careless, and she rested her face against his shoulder. From the sitting room came the sound of William explaining something to Clara with the earnest precision of a big brother who has decided his authority on a subject is final, and from the porch came the sound of Gerald humming to himself over the galley proofs, and from outside came the sound of spring in Wyoming, which is birds and meltwater and wind through grass that is just beginning to find its green. 10 more minutes, Beatrice said. "I know," Simon said, and did not move. She pulled back enough to look up at him. "I have something to tell you," she said. He looked at her. "We are going to need another room added," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then slowly he smiled, and it was the smile she had been watching for 9 years, the one that arrived fully and without reservation, the one that told her everything about the state of things between them. "When?" he said. "November," she said. He pressed his forehead to hers, and they stood like that in the kitchen of their house in Coldwater Creek, Wyoming, in the spring of 1892, with the evening coming golden and long through the window, and the family on both sides of the walls, and the mountains in the north standing where they had always stood, patient and permanent and lit by the last of the day, which was as beautiful as anything either of them had ever seen, which was to say it was exactly sufficient, which was to say it was everything. Their third child was born on a November evening when the first real cold of winter had arrived, and the mountains were white from the shoulders up, and the town was quiet with the particular quality of cold weather quiet that settles over small places when the days go short. He was a boy, healthy and substantial, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's deliberate way of looking at things, and they named him Gerald Simon Boone, for the grandfather who would read him the paper on the porch before he could understand a word of it, and for the father who had stood outside a stage station in the dark because a sheriff said a woman was leaving, and that had been, quite simply, unacceptable. Gerald Barrett sat with the baby the first evening and did not say very much at all, which was unlike him, and when Simon asked if he was all right, Gerald looked up with an expression that was so open and uncomplicated in its happiness that Simon thought of the night he had met Beatrice and of the letter Voss had sent her, and of all the dark machinery that had tried to prevent this evening from existing, and felt, with a depth that he had no adequate words for, the full weight of what had been won. William, at 8, declared the baby considerably less interesting than he had hoped, but acknowledged he would probably improve with time, a verdict which Clara, at 6, disputed on the grounds that she found him entirely interesting and intended to teach him to read at the earliest opportunity. Beatrice lay in the warm bed with the lamp low and listened to her family in the next room, and outside the window the cold wind in the close dark of November, and she thought about a woman standing on a boardwalk before dawn with a carpetbag in her hand and a decision to flee, and she thought about a man in the dark watching a lantern, and she thought about the 6 words a sheriff had said that had changed everything, and she thought that if she could reach back to that woman on the boardwalk she would say only this: "Set down the bag, set it down and stay. There is a man who has walked through the dark to be here, and he is asking for the truth. And the truth is that this is what the rest of your life looks like. This house, this light, these people, this love that you tried so hard not to want because wanting was frightening and now is the least frightening thing you know. Set down the bag. Stay." She had. And the rest had been exactly what she had been told it might be, and also better than that, in the way that the best things always are, exceeding the imagined version not in grand or dramatic ways, but in the daily accumulation of small, specific, unrepeatable moments that together make up a life that is whole. Outside the window of the room where Beatrice Barrett Boone lay in the lamplight, Coldwater Creek went on in the winter dark the way small towns go on, with light in windows and smoke from chimneys and the sound of the creek itself moving under its skin of new ice, south toward the river, and the mountains standing in the north the way they always had, certain and enormous and utterly indifferent to the brief, miraculous fact of human happiness taking place at their feet. But the happiness was real. It was stubbornly, completely, permanently real. And it had begun with a lantern in the dark and a man who would not wait for morning and a woman who had chosen, against all her careful training in the management of hope, to set down her bag and stay. There was nothing left unresolved. Every thread had been drawn back to its proper place. The debt was paid. The villain was defeated by the law he had thought he owned. The father was here on the porch, reading to a grandchild by lamplight. The children were here, opinionated and alive. The man was here, the quiet, deliberate, deeply decent man who had listened to everything and said, "Try me," and meant it every single time. And Beatrice Barrett was here, which was the same as saying she was home, which was the same as saying she was exactly where she had chosen to be, which was the only place in the end that it was ever worth being.